So I decided not to tell you our usual things about we need speakers, we need venues, and so on. I wanted to tell you a few words about tomorrow's and the day after tomorrow conference. So tomorrow start the biggest .NET conference in Russia, .next. I saw some hands up who is going to go tomorrow for the .next. Yeah, and one important thing. To this year, where the .next will be not in the same hotel that last year. So it's also Radisson, but not Radisson Slavianska, it's Radisson Royal. Also on Kievsky station, but different hotel. Please. And also our community, .NET True community, so Russian .NET community will have a stand there. It will be introduced, it will be shown by all cities. Now we have 6 cities in .NET True. And today here we have 2 guys. It's Artem from Krasnoyarsk and Nikita from Saratov. And we'll have some competitions there, and also we have some presents for those who will wear T-shirts or hats or so on with our logo. So if you didn't decide yet what to wear for the conference, please take a T-shirt with msk.net or .NET or so on. So you can find me tomorrow on the conference. And now I'd like to introduce you Raffaele Rialdi. He came from Italy. He also choose our meetup, not speaker's dinner, choose pizza, not very good dishes, so on. So thank you, Raffaele.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. I want to thank you for coming here so in the night for this presentation. And I will talk to you about migrating .NET application to .NET Core. So first of all, I want to know how many of you are already familiar with .NET Core. Okay, that's .NET user group at least, yes. And how many of you are already in production with .NET Core? Okay, that is good. So, first of all, I want to introduce myself very quickly. I am a Microsoft MVP, so I don't work for Microsoft. I am just a consultant. I live in Italy, on the sea. It's warmer than here, you know. Easy win. But I am used to face with many different kind of applications in my life, and I started really too much time ago. I have the box from the DOS 1.0, so it's really a long time ago, and we have a long list of pains and good things that happened all over the computer history with Microsoft and without Microsoft. So there are things that are coming back, and then you can. Okay. Okay. That is fine. And so basically, I mean, there are many applications that are very difficult to move on because we as developers, for certain times, maybe because of our bosses, we know that they say, okay, the application is done. We don't have to move anymore. There is no need to keep the application upgraded. Well, it's working, we are selling it. Well, why should we touch this application anymore? And this is something that happens periodically. And from time to time, you discover that if you wait too much time in improving your application, the application gets older and older, and you lose the feeling with the application itself, and you are not using the right tools at the right moment, and you discover that it becomes also difficult to recompile the application itself, that maybe you are using all the things from the language, all the libraries and you have difficulties in finding the libraries, or maybe there is some security vulnerability and so on. So please never let your application die. And this is the lesson learned in my working experience. I have the pleasure to work with many industries. Currently, I'm working very closely with the manufacturing environment. I also worked with the guys in a racing team in Italy, and it's really amazing to see how many things can happen in a few instances in their domain. So they don't have time to think about what is going to happen. They should go in production instantaneously because it makes a huge difference on the next Sunday. And well, yes, I am an MVP since 2003. It's a long time. And every time I have the pleasure to join the other MVPs and Microsoft guys in Redmond, so I travel to go there, and it's always a pleasure. And from time to time, I also give security conferences. and so, yes, I do care about security. I was part of the developer security group as an MVP. So you already know what is .NET Core. Basically, it's a fork of the .NET framework. So Microsoft didn't start from scratch. They started from the .NET framework source code. This is important because it gives us enough compatibility for most of the things that we want to run on the new CLR. So we have both the new CLR and the new base class library, which is now called Core FX. Everything is published open source, and the new stuff is basically very great, not only because they could run cross-platform. This is one of the goals that we want to reach when we have to put our hands on the source code, but also because they had the occasion to improve the performance inside the CLR itself. When you have billions of applications installed all over the world, you really feel the fear to touch your code base. And you say, okay, if I change this line, I can break 1 million people. That is instantaneously, all application goes down. And so improving the code base just because it performs a little better for this perspective, it isn't really it's a tough decision to take. So the first thing is that they had to break and say, okay, let's create something different. Because you know also, when you go to the .NET framework and you investigate where it is installed, you discover that basically all the bits are the same. They are not really side-by-side deployed. But we still have the old CLR, which is kindly patched in place. But every time you install a new framework, you replace the old CLR with the new one. So there are potential breaks that you can put in your code. And you should always test your application, even if you are on the .NET framework, because every time the customer install a new framework because of another application requires, they could break yours. So you cannot avoid in continuously testing your application under all the conditions, because otherwise there is a risk that something goes wrong. And if you have an important application that runs 24 hours a day in production, well, it may be a problem. Okay. And this is basically why we love containers and we love all the new stuff, because you can isolate things. So this is basically the thing. And this idea of isolating the things is important also, that Microsoft decided to go in a really side-by-side installation of the .NET Core. So .NET Core has a different deployment scenario. And as you know, you can choose if you want to go in a scenario where you install a shared runtime, which is, by the way, side-by-side installed on your machine, so they do not conflict with the previous version. This is important. Otherwise, you can go to the self-contained deployment with your application. This means that you basically have inside a single folder everything you need to run your application, including the CLR itself, including the SOS DLL itself. I mean, everything. So you do not depend either than, I mean, few things from the operating system that are the very basic requirements that every application has, like the runtime library, for example. And it's fun because I have a good friend that since for like 15 years worked at the C++ team, and he was the lead for the C runtime libraries, and he said, "Wow, your library is inside of the old process in Windows." Yes, and if I put a bug there, I screw up the entire ecosystem of Windows application. So it's scary. I mean, it's something that you should think twice before making any chance. Currently, we have the .NET Core 2.1, and it's an important release because it is an LTS, so long-term support. So you can trust that Microsoft will help you if something is wrong with that. And we basically have a lot of scenario. Mainly, we still have only the server-side things. So we have ASP.NET Core, of course, and we have some kind of universal Windows platform that hides the .NET Core inside and in a strange way, but it's not for the purpose of giving you really UI application that will come with .NET 3.0, with the .NET Core 3.0, but really to power up the things that is inside the UWP. And then you have the cloud applications. So basically, you can go to the cloud and deploy things like functions, and your serverless architecture. You can go in containers and so on. So basically, this is the primary target. Of course, the console application is great, and we know that we're starting with the ASP.NET Core. There is no more difference from a console application and an ASP.NET application. I mean, it's extremely important because if you use the very basic pieces of ASP.NET Core application, you can go and create a Windows service that even don't use the HTTP network. Okay, so we really don't need even to use the controller stuff, MVC stuff, or whatever you want. You can get rid of entirely of the HTTP network protocol, even if it's very nice to use even in a local scenario. And you can have also an executable, let's say a self-hosted application that runs ASP.NET Core 2. So we basically have a new kind of starting application. In the past, with ASP.NET, we had to create different hosts depending if you wanted to go in self-hosting or inside IIS or Windows service and so on. And it was not very easy to put all together because we had different conditions. Also, we knew that IIS it's really invasive from the configuration point of view because every time you screw up a small parameter, you risk that something goes wrong in production, and it's difficult to go with it. With the ASP.NET Core, now we have everything there. We don't even need IIS anymore because it's at the moment is just used as a reverse proxy for Kestrel embedded HTTP server, which is great because now we have full control over configuration. We have full control over the performance that are extremely good at the moment. Okay, when they are, if you go to the benchmark in the ASP.NET repository on GitHub, you will see that the top 10. I believe that ASP.NET Core now is at 10th place or 11th place, but the top 10 are so close. They are very small differences that they are still trying to improve the situation, but now we are pretty much done. I mean, it's a matter of, you may have heard of Google trying to promote HTTP 3, the very latest standard for HTTP, because Now the limit of the performance, both for the browser and for the server side, is the TCP protocol. And they want to propose a new standard that will run HTTP3 on the UDP. And they have to care about the acknowledged part, because we know that UDP doesn't have any acknowledge but you can implement it in software, of course. So there are many, many things that are extremely interesting. And I mean, one of the most important, in my opinion, is adopting containers. And if you are scared to go in production with containers, for sure you should try it at least for testing. Because you can really see one of the points that is extremely important for the things that we are talking tonight. So the dependencies. And I wonder how many of you are aware of the real true dependencies of your application at runtime. Because certainly you can go to the reference tree in your project, look at the dependencies and say, okay, these are my dependencies. But this is not exactly what you can expect, because you know that we have the second level of the tree, the third level, and so on. And if you adopted already the new CS format that comes with 2017, with Visual Studio 2017, you have a very small file, not so small, but you have the JSON file with dependencies, the depth JSON, that prints all the dependency tree. And this is very important to understand what are the assemblies that you depend on. But then you don't know still what are the dependencies that they're using at runtime. Maybe there is something that gets loaded lazily from the disk. And so you substantially plug in another tree of dependencies that not necessarily is so obvious to understand. So the only way to understand your dependencies is to analyze your application, take all the assemblies that you believe are there for a reason, and put inside a container, deploy in your test container, and see if the test passes. Because you don't have any other system to evaluate the dependencies at runtime. And this is extremely important, because I found many times in my professional career of applications that, we don't need that. We don't need it. They go in production and the application, boom. Or even worse, when the version is not the one that they expected, because it was published in the GAC. And the global assembly cache is nasty, because it's per machine. So you don't really have control over it. And it's difficult to deploy things there. And this is the reason why .NET Core got rid of the GAC. So what are the libraries that we really can make it work on .NET Core? Basically, there is no UI stack. We know that UI applications are coming. So Microsoft gave that as an announcement during build that with .NET Core 3.0, all the UI stuff is coming, and that's interesting. So you may port like Windows Form application, WPF application. You can mix UWP controls with the WPF together, or even with Windows port. So they understood finally our tons of feedback that if you want to give a migration path to developers, they should allow to use one piece over the other and see what happens, because I don't want to migrate a UI all at once. It's a nightmare for everyone, of course. But I mean, there is, so these are the plans for 3.0, and I invite you to watch to the conference, to the online conference that is going to be broadcasted on December 6th. The Connect 2018. It's extremely important. There are many, many new announcements that were made. So it's an important step for .NET developers. Please watch it. And so one of the first pieces is, of course, ASP.NET Core. And paradoxically, even if this is the framework that we use normally for a server-side application for many reasons, not necessarily a website, but just because you want to publish APIs or to make interop between two processes, ASP.NET has always been a good way to make interop, because inter-process communication on HTTP is good on Windows, because it runs at the driver level, so in ring 0. So this is the reason why HTTP is very good, even, let's say, at the same level of named pipes, okay? But better because you have an application protocol, so you don't have to screw up in deciding how to format the messages, how to give acknowledge, and so on. It's written in the protocol, so you just use the instructions and go for it. You don't have to screw up and invent by yourself things that will take too much. So ASP.NET is important, but migrating from ASP.NET to ASP.NET Core is not that bad. I mean, unless you did a very nasty thing with the underlying structure, controllers are pretty much the same, and you will discover that have API controllers and controllers from MVC now are joined. And so as having a single set of controllers, API, and things that works nicely in both the cases is extremely good. Paradoxically, things can go a bit worse when you come to OData, which had, I don't know, is it my PC? No, I don't think so. There's something. I really don't know what's happening. No. Should work. Okay. Someone is watching us. Okay, if you can ask someone. Okay, thank you. And so paradoxically, yeah, so OData is one of the library had major problems because over the versions introduced the small breaking changes. And so from 5 to 6 and 6 to 7, a few things had to change. So even when you want to go from 6 to 7, for example, you have few things that are named differently. They changed the namespace. They refactored few things. So how many of you are using OData for publishing REST services in a crude way? No one. Yes, one. Okay. Yes. Okay. So yes, this is one of the points that you should care about, because it's not exactly the same library. They migrated to netstandard. It still works on the old ASP.NET. It also works with the new ASP.NET Core, but there are some things that got renamed and adjusted. They now make use of the dependency injection. So they dynamically load the service. If you want to use it outside ASP.NET Core, you still can. I could from a bare straight raw console application, but you have to instruct the dependency injector, otherwise the services are not found and many things are not going to work. So it's possible, but you have to learn how to use it. Entity framework. This is the major glitch in the migration path, because we use it to use Entity Framework 6. And when you migrate an application that is non-trivial, not only you have a different API to describe the model, but you also have problems in things that are not implemented in the current version. So for example, the many-to-many is the one that gave me most of the problems, just because they have the many-to-many in the Entity Framework Core, but they need an intermediate entity. And if you publish your model, so it's public, you cannot change it anymore. You cannot just introduce an entity in the middle. It's a problem. So I made some experiment. It was successful in getting rid of this limitation by making two things. And if you want, I can give you some suggestions if you need to do it. So basically, I wrote some expression rewriting in order to, first of all, I introduced the intermediate entity, but it's invisible. It's an internal one, so you really don't see it publicly. And the first thing that I had to do is to rewrite the expressions in order to pass by the intermediate instead of the direct one. And then also a custom collection that basically do the same at runtime. So when you add, delete, and remove, and do something over the collection, it redirects everything in the intermediate entity. The problem is that you introduce a lot of things that may or may not fit in your application. So this is a kind of glitch in migrating. Also, the way the model is described, so the new API is nice, but there are things that you should very careful, because when you have, for example, implicit and explicit implementation of interfaces, your properties are going to be available in two forms, so the implicit one and the explicit one. And this means that basically the model describer gets faked and does not understand which of the two is the one that is the correct one. And they are going to introduce a patch for this. I had discussion with them, and they are going to use a new system to get the right property in order to avoid this misunderstanding in describing the model. Other things are renamed differently, behave differently. For example, the group by was implemented in version 2.1 because before it was unrolled in memory, which is basically like not having the ability to make queries, because without group by is a mess. But they behave, the link translator is different. In Entity Framework 6, we had the whole translator was made by Microsoft, and now they adopted a third-party kit, link kit, that translate this stuff in an intermediate abstract syntax tree. Then it gets translated to SQL. And this means that a certain query I have seen with my eyes do not behave the same way, especially in the group by queries. So you have to test again all the queries and to understand exactly what is the impact, because you don't want to have different results when you go in production. Okay? So it's something that maybe compiles immediately, but then making it work correctly, it's a different thing. Signalar core is totally rewritten. Let me say that this is easier to test. So the data part is always carrying. It's very difficult to touch. But with Signalar, you basically understand it immediately if there is something that is not going to work. And so, yeah, I can say that is more efficient. In the past, they used a ring buffer, and you had the problems that you risk to rewrite the ring buffer if you had too many events. Now they got rid of the ring buffer, so it works also better for a high-performance application that needs to shoot a lot of events. And then the new platform independent login system. So if you use a ETW, if you use a ETW in .NET, you have problems in migrating this part, because ETW, of course, does not exist in Linux, and so you simply cannot use it. But they created an abstraction that works very nicely both on Windows and Linux. And in Linux, we have LTTNG. And I was happy in seeing my traces with my custom provider, that it was also very simple to create the custom provider, because I just went to GitHub, I saw their provider, and I created the new one, just miming the behavior of the Microsoft one. Underlined part is more or less the one that is in the Nix systems. So, I mean, I am not familiar with macOS, sorry, but it should work with LTTNG. It's a high performance tracing in order to avoid to stop the application, because the normal tracing is, of course, can give you. Okay, yeah. And also the identity framework has major changes, but this can hit you only if you needed to write your custom OAuth provider. Any one of you had to write their custom identity provider stuff? Okay, few things. There is this NuGet package, Microsoft.identity.something, that was rewritten, but it was unlucky that they chose to use the same namespace. But they renamed the entire class library and changed the way it works. So I had to screw up for several days before understanding the new things, and finally it's easy basically, but it's better if you start from scratch. If you are migrating an existing OAuth, maybe you end up in writing more code than needed. And the funny thing is that I was traveling to Seattle. I was in the plane, and I have a few people close to me, and there was a guy who we talked about the luggage and so on. And when we landed in Seattle, we get down. Oh, by the way, and where do you work? I went, I work in Microsoft. Oh, I am going there. I am an MVP. Okay, that's great. And what do you care for? I work in the library. And what is that? The Microsoft Identity Library. Oh my God. He is the guy. That was scaring. I mean, there are 50,000 people in Microsoft. You get? So it was astonishing. Yes, he was the guy. So then netstandard. We all know that netstandard is kind of a magic thing that makes our library works everywhere. So it can work on Mono, it can work on .NET Framework, it can work on .NET Core, and so on. Basically, you should not do anything special from your application point of view. You just use netstandard things, and you know that everything that you write there will work, more or less. Okay, almost. There are, in most of the cases, you really don't have anything to do. But I want to dig this point because it's extremely important. And if you understand well how it works, it can help you in your own application. And so I will skip the boring part because you already used to be familiar with .NET Core and .NET Standard. But if you have questions, please stop me, and we can, at the moment, we can go on. By the way, there is a new version coming, that is the 2.1. There are about 3,000 more APIs. The number is high even for a reason. I mean, you know that there are the new guys in town that are called span of T and memory of T. I will talk about this stuff in .next, by the way. And there are a lot of API that can have now a new overload. Instead of taking a byte array, you just pass a span of T, and your life is getting better because you describe exactly what you want. You can slice, you can do many things in a very, very super performant way. So basically, they had, since they brought memory of T and span of T inside the .NET Standard, okay? Basically, they are going to put also a lot of tons of overload, taking all this stuff. And this is important. So at the time with the 3.0, we will have the .NET Standard 2.1. We still don't know which will be the version of .NET Framework that will get the 2.1. The reason is that for Microsoft, the implementation of the .NET Framework should be extremely stable for the reason that we already discussed. So they don't want to bring new stuff in 5 minutes and put in production. No. So the 4.8 will not get the net standard to 1. Okay. So let's be very clear. They stated that they don't want to do so. So we have to wait for this. VNext for Mono as well, and also the other guys that basically depends on all of this. Yes. No. That's totally wrong. They know very well that .NET Framework will stay there, will evolve slowly, of course, because that's the way it works, the .NET Framework, but having billions of installation, it's impossible. They have to support the .NET Framework for maybe let's say 5.0. I am just taking a number from my head, nothing more. But yeah, it maybe will take. They would just want to be super sure that everything works nicely, that there are no glitches, that there are no overloads that can fake the application when you compile. The problem is not that there is a bug. You can get rid of the bug, but the problem is that they overload precedents, for example, and things like that. You may have problems with applications that maybe are not recompiled since the 2.0 and things like that. I mean, there are many out there, so they don't want to risk anything. They want that everything works nicely, and I absolutely trust them for this. And basically, what did they add? They add span T, memory of T, memory extensions that are an extension methods for the guys. Memory Marshal, which is extremely interesting. If you don't know it, look at that, because it enables you to unsafely cast something to something totally different, from T to K, because you know that it's absolutely correct. And I want to cast, but without copying. And so, ooh, yeah, you have to be extremely careful. But if it's something that you really know that is correct, and you don't want to waste time, come on, that's the guy. And also the read-only counterparts, which is very important because that the string is immutable. So you have you cannot have a span of char instead of a string, but you can have a read-only span of char because it's immutable, and so you cannot change the content inside. And then they are taking a reflection emit, the vector of T, so the SIMD support for a lot of things. So very high performance implementation, description of types that can be implemented in a more performant way. The value task is something that you should use if most of the time the things that you are running are synchronous and not asynchronous, but sometimes can be asynchronous. And so if you don't want to waste in putting in memory the task which brings with it the state machine to describe the callback and all the stuff that Stephen Taub described so well, you should use, in this case, a value task because it's a value type. So you don't waste, let's say, time for the GC support to throw away the memory used for that. And then DB provider factories and so on. So that's basically the story. But if you want to get the complete dump of the difference, it's available because there are the diffs made from Microsoft. So migration, what does it mean? The first thing that I learned to do is, first, you take your old application, let's say an ASP.NET application, and first you upgrade it to the .NET Framework 4.7.2. And this version is magic, is extremely important. Because if you had adopted the net standard in 4.6 or 4.6.1, which is, by the way, Microsoft told us that is the most installed on the planet, you discover that you have to put a lot of binding redirects in the application config file. Okay, it's a kind of nightmare. And if you have control over the host that runs your application, well, you have your own application config, and you are done. But if you are working with something that is outside your control, an example is Dependency, so the host for Visual Studio, EXE. You cannot change his one, because of course it's not your application. You cannot just edit the file because you want to work with it. So basically, there were changes inside the 4672 that in the CLR to automatically redirect to the upper version if it's a minor, of course, not a major, because it would be too risky. This is important. It's exactly the job that is made also from .NET Core and avoids you the mess. And why was it necessary? Because you have seen that on NuGet, now you have a lot of packages with improvements over the basic class library that comes with, let's say, system.reflection, and you have a NuGet package. This system.runtime, and you have a separate .NET NuGet package. And you have reflection extension and system reflection metadata, and you have many of these packages, system buffers, system memory, and you are getting higher minor versions, and that's a problem because every time you want to use that NuGet package, you need to create an application config with the binding redirect. And with the 472, you get rid of all of that. So you can throw it, just delete the application config unless you need something else. And just in case, you also have the auto-generated binding redirects if you need that. And Visual Studio can create it. Also, the second step is creating, converting the libraries to netstandard 2.0. Of course, if it's an easy application, you can start from the very bottom, and programmatically you begin boom, 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 and you end up in having your application. But understanding the dependency graph, well, if you have a very well-written application, it's easy. But in many cases, I discovered that it's not. So it's a problem. This is the reason why we will see in a moment that the use of dependency injection is key in this case. So, and I am not suggesting the use of dependency injection that comes with ASP.NET Core. I mean an external framework like Autofac, for example, but it's just one of the many. Because you get the lazy loading of the DLLs. So you basically end up in retrieving the DLL at runtime as soon as you begin using it. And you can still compile your application even if not everything has been converted to netstandard. So you start converting the DLLs in netstandard. And if it's all your code, it's not a big deal. I mean, it's okay. But what if you cannot convert immediately the part that are relevant to entity framework because you need more time? And so if you isolate the code in a separate DLL and you expose the interfaces for that and load that code dynamically with the dependency injector, you can still add a reference from netstandard to 4.6 or 4.7. Otherwise, you cannot. And you have warnings, problems, and so on. So at runtime, you know that you can run only on Windows in this case, of course, because you did not complete the migration. But at least you see something from your application. You discover that more or less the application is up and running. So this is a crucial step in order to avoid the big jump over the black box, and you don't know what happens then. So it is extremely interesting. And of course, NuGet is your friend because when you really need different implementations of your code, depending on the framework or on the platform or other things, the packaging is the key to survive this stuff. So you may end up in having a different implementation for .NET framework and .NET Core, for example. You want to experiment the things with .NET Core when you go to Entity Framework Core. And if you are running on .NET Framework, the old one, you may want to stay in Entity Framework 6 because it's too early. You didn't have time to test your application enough to guarantee the results. And this is a very good way. But how can you have two pieces that play the same role inside your application? There, the answer is, of course, NuGet. And I mean offline NuGet, not uploading to the Microsoft stuff. So in your ASP.NET application, if you have something that is very, very specific to the infrastructure, of course, you have to understand how to replace this stuff. But basically, most of the time, you end up in converting the controllers, and there is not much to do. I mean, it's a kind of mechanical and monkey work. It's nothing terrible. With regards to the infrastructure, most of the things can be thrown away just because of the dependency injector. You know that in your controllers, in your middlewares, you always have the possibility to receive a registered object with the dependency injector. So you end up in saying, I want my interface is registered in the dependency injector with this implementation. And when you put the name of the type in the constructor of your controller, you receive the instance of the registered object. So basically, there is no more play to create the HTTP controller factory, for example, which is one of the first customization that normally people do to retrieve things that are inside the application, okay? You have questions on this? No? Okay. And maybe at the end, if you want to, I can show you an example. I don't want to, guessing I am a bit late. And then, of course, you want to migrate the application itself. I mean, one of the things that are very, very powerful is the ability to run background services inside the ASP.NET Core. So if you have a task under a timer, let's say, you can easily put your code there and avoid the nasty thing that we did in the past to get recurring items, or maybe loading external data inside our database every half an hour and things like that. But now you have a mainstream way to run background services there. And then finally, if you want, you can add a Docker file to test your application under Linux, and is a pretty good way to do it. By the way, in my repository and on GitHub, there are the coordinates in the slides, by the way, there is a tool called a deploy tool that automate, if you want, the action of deploying an application on Linux. So it opens an SH channel, it copies all the files on the other file, it created a publish so that you can create the self-contained deployment with all the stuff in a single folder. It copy on Linux all the stuff. It ran the CH mode to give the execution permission and all this stuff. So in order to have continuous integration and deployment, I created this tool that you can take a look if you want. There are tools that may help you in analyzing the problem before starting. This is one of that. This migration tool, anyone did already use it? Okay, a couple, very, very few people. This is helpful because if you want, but only if you want, you can even give permission to the tool to upload an anonymous report to Microsoft, so they can see exactly what people is using, and they can improve net standard surface and so on. But basically, you check the boxes and understand if something is good or wrong, and you can easily migrate. This is extremely helpful. And the APIs of .NET is a website that Immo created in order to understand anticipatively where I can find this API. So you end up in a piece of code that does not compile anymore as that standard and say, oh my gosh, how can I survive that. I take the API, I put on the APIs of .NET, and tells you where can you find this API or how can you get it. And this is extremely useful. One of the rules is that you always should avoid updomains because the updomains are no more there. So on .NET Core, we only have the primary updomain, but we don't have secondary updomains anymore. And I have a customer that needed updomains massively. I mean, I warned him, please do not use, because in the future, you know, maybe you will not have this. Oh, we need it. Well, let's go. Boom. They put that domains everywhere, but it's a problem. So basically, you have to either use a different method to make a reflection, and then we'll explain briefly how can you make it, or run a secondary process. And when you are on Linux, the secondary process is not really a big problem because we know that the process efficiency in Linux is very high. In contrast to Windows, where running a process is a slow thing, okay? So you have to compare exactly and know where to go. But in the first, let's say the first case, you use adapt domains just because you wanted the metadata, understand what's inside a DLL and see all the namespaces, the classes, the types, and so on. In this case, you can write your own code. I have to warn you that it's not super easy, and that's why I created a wrapper for that. That is inside the package system.reflection.metadata. Inside that, there is a metadata reader that is a raw reader for the ECMA 335 specification. Okay, so you read just the metadata from disk as reading a normal file. So you don't really load an assembly. So if you don't load an assembly, you don't need to unload it, and you don't need the updomain to unload it. That's basically the point. And this is the first reason. The second one is that you want to run just a process one time and retrieve back the things. And in this case, you may want to use std in, std out, standard input and standard output from the process to give something to the process and receive back the results, like in Linux did for years. Okay, that's the basic point. Otherwise, if you have a continuous exchange of data that you need, so you really use a remoting for exchanging stuff, the suggestion in my case is to use HTTP and specifically a secondary process hosted with ASP.NET Core. So having a REST API, and you talk about whether you talk with it. By the way, you know that is coming a new very smart client in ASP.NET Core, which when you are inside your ASP.NET Core and you need to make a request as a client, you will get a new client that cares about the retries and error management and kind of super client, which is very important because if it fails, you risk to give the wrong answer to the controller. It's not always easy to control the way you take data from the external sites. And also, of course, you have to avoid the registry. The basic thing has been implemented, but of course, if you try to do other things like loading settings and things like that, of course, in Linux, it's just a platform not supported or something like that. So basically, you don't have it. So you should find another way to store your things, or eventually having two different DLLs depending on the platform that you are running, and we will see it in a moment. And also ETW, we already talked about it. So we covered the main aspect of how it works, and I hope it's clear. I want to give you a suggestion, starting from a bit of theory on the packages. So The type forwarding is a concept that is in .NET since a long, long time. It's basically, what does it mean? That we have, I wrote a long list of slides just because I know that English is your mother tongue. So when you come back to the talk, and you maybe can just read the slide and have more clear certain concepts. So let's make the short version in person, and then you have the details there. So the type forwarding is something that you create an assembly, and inside you just use an attribute that it's a kind of forward for types. You declare that there is a type inside, but it's not really there. There is no implementation, no description, nothing. Okay, and why you should use this trick, and that the .NET framework is using itself for a long time. The reason is that you want to be free to move the types from one assembly to another over your versions without breaking the compatibility. So you want just to tell your customer, if you want to use this API in my library, please add the reference to this library, and you are done. But in your implementation, having everything inside that is something you cannot sleep on the night, and you want really to make a change. So instead of asking your customer to change the number of references, you really do a different job. So you create this fake assembly with just a type redirection, and then you play the work on the other assemblies. And you are done, because it's basically a facade. And this is exactly what happens. So the very basic is another type of assembly that is called the reference assembly, which is a kind of more advanced. So you really write the description of the type with all the public methods, properties, and events, but you provide no implementation at all. So basically, you have just a reference. You declare that a type exists that have these methods with these parameters and these properties and these events. And you don't care about the implementation. You just throw null, okay? You don't need anything. These are reference assemblies. And what happens? That basically, when you go at runtime, you don't put in your binary folder the reference assembly, of course. But you make the nasty trick of replacing the file before running. And so you use the reference assembly during design time with Visual Studio, so that Visual Studio can give you the IntelliSense and understand what's happening there, and taking the dependency tree complete. And then when you publish your application, you replace the files with the good one that have the exact public surface that they expect, of course. Otherwise, it won't work, okay? And once you replace the files, it simply works. Of course, you don't have to sign with the strong name the assemblies. Otherwise, you get lost. So you cannot register in the GAC and so on. But that's the trick that is done with netstandard. If you look at the netstandard NuGet package, you open it, you go in the ILSpy, you put your assembly there, you will discover there are tons of throw nulls. There is nothing inside. Because the netstandard is a contract. It's just a promise that someone will implement this public surface, okay? And you have the guarantee that at runtime you will find the right one. So they play this nasty thing. During design time, you have the reference assembly. And then during runtime, you have a netstandard that does not have the implementation, has the type forwarding. So basically, you get a netstandard with a huge number of facade that redirects the types to the real types. And if you're running on the .NET framework, they provide you a netstandard that redirects to MS-core-lib, to system.runtime DLL, to system-flexion DLL, and so on. So basically, you have these kind of hooks, let's say. And the most complex one, that is the one played with a system object, is this. So you basically have, during design time, an initial facade that tells you, well, the type that you are looking, system object, is there. And then you go to the net standard contract and say, okay, I am the system object, but I am, you know, I am just a reference, I am nothing more. So you can play with me in the IDE, but nothing more, sorry. Then you go in the implementation side, and when you are at runtime, the net standard with the type forwarding that is relevant to .NET Framework 4.7, let's say, is copied in your bin and say, okay, let's load this type. Where is my type? And say, oh, sorry, again, we don't have your implementation here. You should go to mscorelib. And finally, the system object is found. And all this redirection works very, very nicely. But you understand immediately that you need a package for this, because you need to do the nasty thing to say, okay, I have a single package, which is, by the way, a zip file, that is used for a part at design time from Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code. And the other parts are played on runtime, depending on the CLR that is loading the stuff. So when you publish your application, you should specify your runtime identifier, which is .NET Framework or .NET Core and so on, in order to specify which one of the implementation you need. And inside that, you will find eventually the redirection to the other side. So if you want to generate your own reference assemblies, now Visual Studio finally has the support. We got it. And it basically translates in produce reference assembly to true, which means basically that inside your bin folder, you will get an additional folder with just the reference assembly. If you load it with ILSpy, you will see a huge list of throw nulls. There is nothing, okay? But if you package all this stuff together, so your implementation, your reference assembly, you end up in having this, the results that I was telling you before. So how can we work with this stuff? Briefly, I know that we are a bit late, right? Sorry for that. So the primary strategy is this one. Please do not do it. It's bad. It's super bad. This is not the right way. We basically have, as a project, the goal to create an assembly, a library, that get the process ID both on Windows and Linux. Okay? There are different stories, so you cannot share a common path for both. So you have a pinvoke for Windows on one side, and you have a different pinvoke for Linux on the other side, and run so even on different frameworks. So it's totally different. Okay? As you can see, even here, okay, I fake it with define Linux here, but you understand that even you can specify the labels of the define in the project file or in your build system. This is extremely difficult to understand how it works. Eventually, I would suggest you to have a kind of shared project. You know, the shared project is the one that you add just the source files, but there is no target. You cannot compile it. It's just a container for source file. And then when you go to a real project, you add the reference to the source to the shared project, you end up in having that source files as it were added directly to the main project. Okay? What is the advantage? That if you have, if you are editing something, you end up in having in this combo box the ability of choosing which one is the one that you are using depending on the framework that you want to use. I will show maybe at the end. So the second strategy, because this one is really a mess, is, yes. Okay. So this is a process info, and we created manually our reference assembly, okay? In this case, I created it manually because I want to show you how it works. But in reality, we can ask a Visual Studio to do that. And if you are compiling dynamically using Rosling with your code, there is an option to specify, to tell to Rosling to create the reference assembly. So you have full control over it. The Linux-specific implementation now, it's better. I mean, you can read this code. It's easy, right? And of course, you have the Windows-specific implementation, which is also very nice to read. It's easy to maintain. I mean, that's important, because when you have many people inside your team, you don't want to screw up with if and if and so on, okay? Finally, you have the new spec. And the new spec is the important part. So we are creating a package, and I left here some memos, where here I have the shim, so the ref. Ref, in this case, is the reference assembly. This section is used by the IDE to provide you the IntelliSense and whatever else. Okay, so it's a kind of reference implementation. And it means basically that you can compile just with this library, not even having the implementation. So the compiler can just use this one. Then we have the runtime section. Win is for Windows, of course. Library, which is the library. And which kind of library? We can have netstandard, we have net461, and so on. We can have a very long list of runtime identifiers that are inside the Microsoft documentation. Okay, and finally, this is the DLL that I expect. That must have, of course, the same name. And this is the Windows implementation that is inside the runtimes, Linux this time, library, netstandard 2, and so on. But if you want, you can even get a different implementation for the bitness, so x64 or x86. Or you can even go beyond and having a different implementation for like CentOS, Red Hat, or Ubuntu, and so on. So you have full control. Even for Windows, you have Win, x86, 64, ARM, and so on. So it's a very long list of possibilities. And when you go to the client, you end up in having these dependencies, which is the process info NuGet package. And you don't have to care about anything. I mean, you just execute your application, and depending on the runtime, in this case, of course, is Windows. You have the choice of the right DLLs that is needed to run on this project, on this machine. Okay. The good part is that you already deployed the correct one, so okay, you can trust me that is Windows PID and so on. So this is the shortest. Sorry, otherwise I have to recompile everything, which is possible, but it takes more time. So let's go straight to the point. So here you have the steps, so I can skip this because we already got it in the demo. The platform-specific implementation compared, and how you should pack it inside your new spec file. And I will close the discussion, and then we will pass to the question, of course, where the migration is pretty much easy. I mean, I never found steps that are so difficult to implement. It depends from the libraries, basically. So if you find that you have every library has already been upgraded to net standard, you have some glitches, especially with the entity framework. But of course, most of the other things are done. So depending on how much your data access is complex, you may find it very easy or more complex. And let's not forget that the Entity Framework 6 will be migrated to .NET Core 3.0. So they already announced this. So if you really are not able to go with the Entity Framework Core in this version, you will get for free, let's say, Entity Framework 6 and the next version. Let me say that I don't like too much the idea to stay in Entity Framework 6. It depends basically from your application, but I don't like it too much because there are huge improvements, and the team already stated that they are not going to put new stuff inside the ORM. So you cannot, you will probably never get like the batch updates that are inside the Entity Framework Core implementation. You will not get many other features that will be instead evolved only in Entity Framework Core. They are migrating. You may ask me why. Basically to ease the migration process, because they understood that this is a major blocker for people that is not able to upgrade, and even because the data layer is the lower one in the dependency tree, and so for the reason that I told you before, it's difficult to upgrade something that is blocked at a very basic level. So that's basically everything. I want to close with this thing.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
So here is a plan. We have 10 minutes for Q&A session. Then I will tell you three sentences in Russian, and then we will end. So
okay.
Questions? You had it. No? No more questions? Okay.
Raffaele, thank you. My name is Andrei, and I have questions. If we launch the same application on Cornet on Windows and Linux, what is faster?
Well, there are many things that can happen. In many cases, if there are only a CPU stuff, probably they will go the same. If you are doing a lot of I/O, it will basically depends on the stack that you have below. On the HTTP stuff, I can guess that you have a better implementation in Windows that is at ring 0. But in many other cases, you get a very nice implementation. It's very fast also on Linux. So as I said before, for example, when a winning point for Linux is the inter-process communication. When you have to run a lot of processes, we know that the pipes are one of the basic building blocks in Linux, and so you will get better performance there. But it depends. As Rico Mariani in Microsoft for years said, you have to measure your own application. You cannot give statements about performance that are so wide. I mean, you have really to measure your... remember that for micro benchmarks, you have benchmark.net that is very easy to use, and it's super powerful. And I will give some performance detail tomorrow in .next on the span of T and memory of T. But in things like that, you should make a test. It's very simple. So you should end up in trying and see what can happen. And I can tell you more. If you find that something is behaving not as expected, if you give feedback on GitHub, it won't get lost. I mean, they do care absolutely. They want to stay in touch with the community. They want to bring feedback. And if you even want to provide some suggestions, they are super open to get contribution and suggestion as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks for your presentation.
You're welcome.
In your talk, you will mainly focus on the migrating from .NET Framework to the .NET Core 2.1. But the question is, how do you have a set of tips how to migrate from .NET Core 1.1 to .NET Core 2.1? Because there are a lot of major API changes and stuff like that.
Yeah, super true. Luckily enough, the documentation in Microsoft is going to get better, and they already provided pages with the differences in what got renamed. For example, in ASP.NET Core Identity, on the authentication stuff, there is a long list of things that they changed and why they changed it, and how you can upgrade your application. So you should find it online in the official documentation. The glitches are really before. I had no time to talk about the new CS Proj, for example, transitioning from the packages config to the package reference inside the CS Proj, which is extremely powerful tool in the new Visual Studio. It takes time to give the whole story, but basically Microsoft is going there. So one of the steps that you may want to do is also to adopt the new package reference in order to have all the benefits there. But once you have you are in .NET Core 1.0, yes, in theory, following the procedures that are inside the documentation, you should go there. Hope so.
Hello, my name is Artyom, and thank you very much for your comprehensive slides. So the question is, in the beginning you mentioned that Microsoft allows us to embed components from Windows Forms applications into VPF applications and the Universal Windows Platform application. So we know there is a framework named Avalonia UI that runs on .NET Core. It's a cross-platform implementation of the UI using native APIs that you described. So does Microsoft has plans to allow us integrate our custom XAML controls, Avalonia controls, or...
So take a breath and watch the December 6th presentation. I cannot say anything else. Sorry.
Thank you.
But I really recommend you to watch the presentation. Yeah.
That's all? Ah, sorry.
Good evening. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was most enlightening. I'd like to ask about the approach to migrating large legacy behemoths from .NET Framework to .NET Core. Which would you recommend the recommended approach should be? Should you rewrite the whole thing altogether while implementing new features in parallel in .NET Core and in .NET Framework? Or should you try to separate bits and features that are separable and try to make them run at production at two applications and make them interoperate? I think both approaches are not ideal, because in one approach you have to implement new features in parallel twice, basically. And the second one means that you have to, you might find bugs in interoperability. You have to run two applications at once, and you have to find those bits and pieces that can be separated.
Absolutely.
Any advice?
Absolutely. I agree on this. I can say that the way you want to migrate it mostly depends on your application. I found that rarely you have application that can be sliced vertically in a clear manner. And so you end up in having problems if you want to have a partial implementation here and there. One thing that I did not say that maybe you already know, ASP.NET Core also works on .NET Framework. So if you really need to have something that just works on that framework, you can stay on everything on for 7.2 without migrating on NetStandard as a first stage. and watching your application running there. So a very, very first step can be to migrate just the code of the controllers and stay with everything below on the classic library as you used to have before. And this may ease the initial step, but I would recommend to migrate the entire web code base at once and not having two implementations at the same time. Well, the benefit that how can you justify to your boss that you want to migrate the couch? So this is one of the questions that they normally have, performance. That's basically the main idea, and the better maintainability is the other. So it's far better to, it's far easier to maintain the ASP.NET Core code because if you use correctly the dependency injection, you have very separated part of the code. You can unit test better without having to invent strange mocks and things like that. So it's more testable. You have many other possibilities in the new stack, but having two code base, the same code base on two different platforms at the same time, it sounds very complicated.
So that's all for Q&A session. A few sentences in Russian. Apologize.
Yeah, please.
Ребят, я устала по-английски. Короче, завтра на .next будет стенд. Ну, Юля об этом сказала, просто продублирую. Будет стенд сообщества. На стенде будут не только москвичи. Нас много городов, 6 городов, вы поняли. Будет, господи, неважно кто. Приходите и познакомитесь. Будет Саратов и будет Красноярск. Артем из Красноярска. Казань не приедет, хотя собиралась. Вот. Приходите, пожалуйста, в футболках. Если вам безразлично, то надевайте футболки любые, которые вы заработали на наших митапах. Это футболка с техтрейна. Значит, что еще? Да, мы планировали какие-то активности. Приходите. Загляните на минуточку на стенд лаборатории Касперского. Там что-то тоже планируется. Вот. Значит, это, вот что я хотела сказать. И последнее. В следующий раз мы с вами встречаемся, по-моему, 11 декабря в Озоне. Но это не точно. И 15-го мы снова планируем субботник. Год назад мы это делали в Сенаме. 15-го мы делаем это в Додо. Мы очень стараемся. Вроде бы будет не хуже, возможно, даже лучше, но это, опять же, не точно. Всем большое спасибо за внимание. Мы закончили.
Thank you.